Guys, so we're going to go through the third section of this chapter in chapter 6, and it is going to be on bone structure. So let's go through the anatomy of a long bone. And this could be the femur that we got here, or it could be the humerus, but all the long bones have the same basic part. So let's talk about the three kind of zones on the long bone to begin with. So the long bone is long. So that long shaft right in the middle that you would grab hold of first, if you were going to pick it up off the table, is going to be the diaphysis. The diaphysis. So that is the long shaft, and it is filled of mostly compact bone. Is what you're going to find in there. And compact bone, we're going to talk about why it's durable and it's strong, and it can withstand your body weight in one direction. That is compact bone, and you're going to find that all throughout the edges of the diaphysis. The diaphysis is the middle of the long bone. And then let's go towards the end. The ends of the bone, where the joints are going to be, are called the epiphysis. The epiphysis. Those are the far ends, where this long bone is going to meet up with other bones at the joint ends. Those are the epiphysis. And since they are joint ends, they are going to be made out of spongy bone, because we said spongy bone can withstand pressures at different angles. So the hip, we got the femur here, and the femur is going to go into the hip at a ball and socket joint, and it's going to get pressure from all over. It's a pretty flexible joint, so we need spongy tissue that is filled with trabeculae that we're going to have a better picture of later in the epiphysis. We learned terms already about proximal and distal. Which one was closest to the point of attachment and which place was further from the point of attachment? So we already know these from chapter 1. So remember, proximal is going to be closest to the point of attachment. So this right here, this articular cartilage, is where it is going to attach into the hip joint right there. So that's closest point of attachment. So it is the proximal epiphysis, and further away at your knee is going to be the distal epiphysis. So we talked about the diaphysis, the place in the middle of the long bone. The epiphysis are going to be the ends of the long bone. And then there's going to be a place in the middle, and we talked about middle, meta. If you hear M-E in there, immediately start thinking about the middle. So the middle is going to be the metaphysis, or metaphysis, however you want to pronounce it, as long as you can spell it correctly. That's all I care about. So that is kind of like the neck of the bone. Heading up there is the metaphysis. It's this narrow zone in between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. It's going to have a place called the epiphyseal. There I go. I can get my words out today. The epiphyseal plate. It's also called your growth plate. So as we all are growing, my kids are growing like weeds right now, and their epiphyseal plate is located there. And when you are growing, it is filled with cartilage. It's going to be cartilage cells in there. It has a little gap in there where it's growing, and it's constantly filling and replacing the cartilage with bone as the bone expands. And that's your growth plate, your epiphyseal plate. And as we get older, when we're finally at the height we're going to be on our long bones, then that cartilage completely gets replaced with bone tissue, and the bone growth just halts. But you're still going to have a line there, the epiphyseal plate, where growth was occurring when you were younger in your childhood. So know these three regions. And we got diaphysis, the long part. Epiphysis are the ends. There's a proximal and a distal, and then there's the metaphysis, and it's going to house the growth plate, the epiphyseal plate, in the middle, in between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. There is going to be a medullary cavity. So we talked about in previous videos, medulla is always going to be on the inside of something, and the cortex is always going to be on the outside of something. So the medullary cavity is that picture that we showed before that's going to have the bone marrow in it. And there was red bone marrow and there was white bone marrow. And we said that red bone marrow is in charge of all the hematopoiesis, all the blood cells. Thank you. That is going to be made is happening in the red blood cells. And then as we age, some of that gets replaced with fat, and that turns it into yellow marrow. So we can see the yellow bone marrow. And then we are going to talk about, there's that epiphyseal line where the growth plate has now hardened up and it's all bone there. Um, we'll go into the endosteum and the periosteum in the next slide because it's a better picture of that. But definitely know epiphysis, diaphysis, metaphysis in the middle. Let's talk about the periosteum. This is the outermost part of your bone tissue. It's going to be superficial layer. It's going to have fibrous outside and cellular inside to it. Here's our fibrous layer and our cellular layer. And so again, it's the outermost covering on the bone. So it's going to protect the bone from any of the surrounding tissues. It's going to be a place where bones are vascular. If you break a bone, you are probably broken a blood vessel in there somewhere and it will bleed. So we have to be able to get that blood flow and those nutrients into the bone because again, this is a mineral storage reservoir. It's active. So the bone is surrounded by the periosteum, but we got to be able to get the blood and nervous supply into those bones. So they've got to go in through the periosteum. It is going to help and be a site of bone growth and repair if you've ever fractured a bone. It is no fun, but hopefully you were able to repair it correctly and your body takes over with cells that we're going to talk about, the 4 different types of cells involved in bone maintenance and growth. As far as tissues involved in the periosteum, you're definitely going to have some collagen fibers that are going to anchor into the periosteum. So we mentioned tendons and ligaments before. And ligaments are going to anchor bone to other bone, and tendons are going to anchor muscle to the bone. But both of those we talked about were going to be dense, regular connective tissue. They were filled with lots of collagen fibers. They were very strong in one direction, and those bad boys are anchored into the periosteum. So they should not rip off the bone. They would rather break your bone than rip those collagen fibers out of the periosteum. It is that strong. So those collagen fibers are buried into the periosteum. It is a very strong attachment point. And we said, yeah, it's going to break a bone before it will rip off the periosteum. It is going to have dense, irregular tissue in here that is going to meet up with that dense, regular stuff coming from the ligaments and the tendons. What else? I think that covers it. Again, periosteum is the outermost outside part of the bone, and then we'll work our way in past the periosteum into the endosteum. So on the endosteum, this is going to be the inside liner of stuff. It's the inner membrane of the bone, and it's going to line the canals for the blood supply. It's the internal membrane of the bone. It's going to line the medullary cavity that we talked about, that bone marrow, and the inside, the red bone marrow, the yellow bone marrow. It's going to be really active when we're talking about bone growth, where our bones are growing not only in lengthwise, but also in diameter. It's going to help in repair and remodeling. It's also going to cover spongy bone, because we said spongy bone is going to be slightly different from our compact bone. So we're going to have endosteum on those guys, and it's going to have osteogenic cells, and we're going to talk about those 4 cells in, yeah, we got a blow-up picture of those 4 cells. So we'll talk about those in just a minute. We'll get to those. So periosteum is on the outside of the bone, the outermost outside of the bone. And then inside that is the endosteum. And it is going to be lining all the cavities in the spongy bone. That is the endosteum. And we're going to talk about the cells, these guys, osteoclasts, osteocytes, osteogenic cells, and osteoblasts in just a little bit. What about the flat bones? So those long bones have compact bone that are going to be all along the edges. Compact bone is super strong. It can withstand lots of force on it. And if we've got compact bone and we've got the periosteum says it has collagen fibers in it in all these different directions. So this stuff is super duper strong. I think the textbook of the outlines referenced it as an analogy of not just as strong as concrete, it's strong as reinforced concrete, concrete reinforced with rebar. That's how strong the bone tissue is with those collagen fibers in there. It's very, very strong. So our long bones are going to have compact bone going up and down the length of the bone in the diaphysis, and then the epiphysis, we're going to have spongy bone tissue. So in our spongy bone, they are going to have compact bone, or a flat bone, sorry, they'll have a very thin layer of compact bone, and the majority of the flat bone is going to be spongy bone. You may also see that layer of spongy bone called diplo when it's in reference to that the flat bones. And just like on the long bone that we saw before, periosteum on the outside. Terminology. You will need to know these. You need to know these on the lab practical. When it points to a structure, what's this? What's this structure? You'll need to know all the names of those things given to you in the lab handout. Know them, love them. And in the lecture test, how I'm going to ask you about those, it'll probably be matching. It'll probably be a description and maybe an example of, let's see, where is one? So if we were talking about a rough projection, a rough surface projection on the bone found in the deltoid area, then we would know, oh, tuberosity. She's talking about a tuberosity. The deltoid tuberosity is what she's going for. So we might have examples of those. What is a condyle? All of these terms. We're going to need to know these terms. Know these terms. Know them. Condyles, rounded, smooth surfaces. Occipital condyles are always my go-to, but there are condyles in other places. Know these bone markings. The iliac crest, fossas. There's going to be a couple fossas out there. Mandibular fossa. Their scapula is going to have fossa. The hips are going to have fossa. You're going to have sulci are going to be grooves. We'll talk about the sulci and the gyri when we talk about our brain too. But sulci will be grooves. If you've got holes through a bone, so blood flow is coming through this hole, nervous tissue is coming through this hole, so you have sensation, like it's mentioning the foramen magnum and going into your skull itself. So there's a giant hole in the back, so hence the name magnum, because it's a big hole. Foramen magnum literally means big opening. So that's an example of one. There's also smaller ones on your chin. There's mental foramen, 2 of them right here. If anybody has dental work and they need to numb you up, they're going for those guys right here, and they want to numb the nerves that are coming through that hole. So know these terms. A meatus is going to be a decent size hole. Foramen are going to be slightly smaller, unless we're talking about the foramen magnum, because it's like the biggest. Sinuses are going to be basically like air pockets. They're like air pockets embedded in the bone. So you have sinuses here, you have sinuses up here. Anybody who's ever had a sinus infection knows exactly what I'm talking about when you talk about sinus pressure. And they are going to be air-filled pockets in the bone. So know the terminology on these bone markings. Study the chapter outlines that give you these descriptions. Look at the PowerPoints for imagery that goes along with this. Look at the lab modules that tell you what an example of these bone markings are. You need to know these. Here are great examples on OpenStax on pictures of where a tuberosity might be, or another type of condyle. Oh my goodness. The condyles, we said those were those smooth rounded edges. Occipital condyles, here we've got the condyle down at the bottom of the knee where the patella is going to meet, and it's nice and smooth. If you were able to touch it and rub your finger over it, you could see how smooth it is. We have tubercles. There's going to be a sulcus, and remember that was a groove. The head are the easiest ones to me. You hold up a femur and I can find the head of that bone. That's a pretty easy one. But there, again, more tubercles. And your tubercles, are they lateral or medial? Are they going towards the outside? Are they going towards the inside of the body? Are they superior or inferior? All those terms that we had to learn in chapter 1 are coming into play now when we are memorizing these bone parts, because sometimes those terms will be on there and they will help you when you start to memorize these things. Okay, this is superior, so this is on the top one, and we're on the inferior, so this has got to be the inferior part of it, the bottom part of the bone. Examples of crests, those fossa, those basin-like depressions in the hips. Those sinuses, I was telling you, those air pockets, they're in green on this picture. Protuberance, your chin. You got a mental protuberance right here, and then you got two mental foramen right here. Here's the foramen. They're not marked, but that's a foramen, that little hole. So there are examples here in the textbook. We will go through more of these descriptions in chapter 8 and chapter 7. I'm telling y'all again one more time that the lecture test will be more focused on chapters 5 and 6 because there's more questions for me to pull from 5 and 6. Chapters 7 and 8 will have less pressure on the lecture test. There'll be less questions. It won't be 25 questions from 7 and 8. It'll probably be closer to like 15 a piece maybe from 7 and 8 because there's not a whole lot of lecture content I can do, but you will definitely have a whole lab practical needing to know these. So when I go through videos for lectures 7, chapter 7 and chapter 8, it will be reinforcing these bone markings on the bones. That's all basically chapter 7 and 8 is, with a few other things put in there as far as levers and stuff like that. So know your bone markings. We're starting on it here in chapter 6, but you're going to see them again in chapter 7 and chapter 8 to help reinforce these. Know your bone markings. Be able to identify your bones on site. Know which bones go into which type of skeleton. Is it axial or is it appendicular? Is it a long bone? Is it a flat bone? All of these are things that you will need to know for the upcoming lecture test. So I'm telling you now, know your bone markings. Here's another example of a great ramus. They don't have it marked, but it's there, these arm-like extensions. Bone markings. You just gotta memorize them. Composition of bone. So when we talk about bone, we're going to break it down into two groups. There's going to be the osteoid, and that's going to be a lot of collagen fibers in there, and it is approximately 1/3 the weight of your skeletal system is made out of this osteoid with these collagen fibers in there. And collagen is very strong, but it's bendy. It's bendy. And then the rest, the other 2/3, are going to be the hydroxyapatates. Those hydroxyapatates are going to be your mineral salts. So we talk about calcium was super important in the bone. It gets stored in the bone. So we are going to have calcium phosphate, and it's going to interact with calcium hydroxide, and that's going to form crystals of hydroxyapatate. And so you're going to form these calcium salts, this hydroxyapatates. And again, it is 2/3 of the bone. And if we combine these really strong salt crystals with the flexibility of the collagen fibers, it makes it very, very strong substance. You can perform an experiment like they did in this picture. It's one of my favorites that I like to do. If I have time, and if you have time, you can take a chicken bone, like maybe I'd like to make chicken noodle soup for my kids. And so I'll take a wing bone is perfect. It's the perfect size. It's small enough that you can take this chicken wing bone, and it's cooked and it's hard, right? So it's really tough. You can put that bone in a jar, and if you fill it and cover the bone up with vinegar. Vinegar is an acid. And so if that bone sits in that jar of acid for long enough, the acid eats away all the stuff. And if we take away the hydroxyapatites that are 2/3 of the weight of the bone, we're left with nothing but the osteoid, and that's collagen fibers. And that's why it is so bendy in this picture. It's because they got rid of all the calcium salts, the hydroxyapatates, and what's left over are the collagen fibers. And so it's really kind of crazy cool to look at this bone that you know is solid, but then you can bend it because of those collagen fibers inside of there. So it's kind of neat. So those are the two major chemical components: hydroxyapatates, your calcium salts, and then your osteoid, your collagen fibers in there. Bone cells. We need to know bone cells. I'm definitely going to have a lecture quiz question and probably a few lecture test questions on these too. So know them, love them. First, we'll start with the stem cells. The osteogenic cells, you may also hear them called osteoprogenitor cells. Anytime you hear gen, think Genesis, think new life, first book of the Bible. If you're a Christian, it's the beginning. Genesis is the beginning. So osteogenic is making new bone cells. These are the bone stem cells. Osteogenic, osteoprogenitor cells. They are these stem cells. What bone cells are they making? Well, our baby bone cells, we talked about in chapter 1, we had blasts, we talked about were immature cells, and sites were mature cells, blasts and sites. So if it's an osteoblast, it's an immature bone cell. If it's an osteocyte, it's a mature bone cell. What makes the difference between the two? So we're going to have an osteoblast right here. He forms the bone. So the osteoblast is laying down all the calcium salts and this bony matrix, and eventually the osteoblast is going to lay down this bony matrix. It's going to ossify, it's going to harden up around this cell. And remember how we talked about cartilage and bone cells are both in their lacunae. Their little lakes is what lacunae means. It literally means little lakes. And so it basically, an osteoblast pretty much paints itself into a corner. It paints itself into a little lake where it's trapped itself. It has trapped itself. Once it has laid down enough bony matrix all around itself, it's laid down enough osteoid and it's surrounded itself, it hardens up and it's stuck in its little lake. It then becomes from an immature osteoblast to a mature osteocyte. So we go from a blast to a mature osteocyte, which then maintains the bone tissue around it. So osteogenic cells are going to be the stem cells that are going to make the osteoblasts, and then those blasts will surround themselves with enough osteoid that they basically paint themselves into a little corner, into their own little lake, and that's the lacunae, and they live inside there as a mature osteocyte that are going to help maintain the bone over time. What about breaking down bone? Because sometimes you fracture the bone, and when you fracture the bone, you got to heal it. And when you heal it, you're going to lay down new calcium salts, you're going to lay down new bone tissue and try and cover up that. And you end up with basically a scar on top of your bone. Well, you need to be able to get rid of that scar. You don't want the lumps there forever. So there's a cell that will help break those down. So that's our fourth type of cell, and that is the osteoclast. He can break down the bone tissue. So osteoclasts are digesting cells. They're going to remove bone and recycle it. Maybe you didn't fracture a bone, but maybe your maybe your blood calcium is really low. And again, I said calcium is super duper important. We use it for communication, to turn on our muscles. We need calcium. And so if calcium levels are low, you know where your body's going to look to find more calcium? Your skeletal system, because we said that's where it's holding all of the calcium. It's the calcium storage center. So how do we break up the calcium and get it into the bloodstream? Osteoclasts. Osteoclasts do that for us. So they are going to reabsorb. So clasts are going to break down the bone. Blasts will build the bone. And once they build the bone around them enough, they turn into osteocytes, mature bones, cells. So know these four guys. Osteogenic are the osteoprogenitor cells. Osteoblasts are baby builder cells. And then they will turn into mature osteocytes, the mature guys. Osteoclasts are going to be the opposite of an osteoblast, and that they will break down, reabsorb the bone tissue. So know these four cells. I always got a question about these on the lecture test. What about that microscopic anatomy? We see a picture of this in the lab module, in the lab manual. You need to know these terms. So let's go through them. We talked about the outside of the bone, the outermost layer was the periosteum, right? Periosteum. And then underneath the periosteum, and it had the outside and the inside. And then there was going to be the endosteum. So we are going to have the endosteum. It's going to be all of this other bone tissue in here. We have the medulla, the medullary cavity, where the red bone marrow is hanging out. The inside, the bone marrow, is in the medullary cavity. We've got spongy bone that's going to line this stuff with its trabeculae and its arches. And then we are going to have this compact bone on the outside of the bone tissue. So whether it's a flat bone or a long bone, we got a little layer or even thicker layer on a long bone of compact bone. The compact bone is going to be made out of, we talked about osteoblasts that paint themselves and surround themselves with osteoid, and then eventually that's going to harden up and they turn into osteocyte. When they do this, they're going to lay down this stuff and they lay it down in rings. Those rings are called lamellae. Lamellae. There are the lamellae. And so we are going to have interstitial lamellae that will be found in between the rings, and then we have concentric circles. The circular lamellae are the concentric lamellae, and then in between the circles that kind of bridge the gap and fill up the places are the interstitial lamellae. So there's two types of lamellae. All of them are going to be bony matrix. One of them is bony matrix in a circle, and one of them is bony matrix that fill in the gaps in between the circles. So circumferential are the circle ones, interstitials go in between, and those are the lamellae. So we covered lamellae. Let's talk about the circles. All of it all together. If you look and it looked like, you chopped a tree down and it looks like tree rings in there. The rings are your lamellae. They are your concentric lamellae. All of it together is called an osteon. It's an osteon. So if I was looking at this slide, this is compact bone right here. This whole structure is an osteon. It's going to include all of the concentric lamellae inside of there, and then it's going to include other structures that we need to know. So we need to know the blood vasculature going through here. We said is highly vascular. Bone tissue is highly vascular. So we are going to have a central canal that comes up. It runs vertically. I want to say north and south. It runs vertically up and down the bone is going to be the central canal. You may also hear it called the haversian canal. The haversian canal is the central canal, goes up and down. Then you're going to have perforating, central canals here. Perforating canals are going to be perpendicular to the central canal. So that's going to be these guys over here. So that's our blood flow. Central goes up and down. Perforating is going to go left to right on our blood flow. And then we need to talk about the cells in here. If I could have a really good picture of it. There we go. This is a really good picture of the cells inside of this. So remember we said this whole thing is an osteon. And then this is concentric lamellae. We talked about the 4 cells, and there were osteoblasts, and they were laying down bone, and eventually they're going to surround themselves, and they are stuck in this little lake called a lacunae. And inside the lacunae will live a mature osteoblast, which now is called an osteocyte. And the osteocyte lives in the lacunae. And in this little lake, we are going to need to get nutrients from one cell to the next cell to the next cell from this blood flow that we talked about, central canal and the perforating canals. We need to get those nutrients to the cells, to the osteocytes stuck in those little lakes. How do we get the nutrients to the cells stuck in the little lakes? We use little canals that connect the little lakes. So the little canals are called canaliculi. Can I lick your eye? If that helps you remember that. It's not spelled that way, but if it helps you remember how to pronounce it, canaliculi. They are all of these things. So these little canals, these little grooves through the lamellae that are going to connect the lakes, the lacunae, to other little lakes. So these are all canaliculi right here. All those. So no lacunae, no canaliculae. Lacunae are lakes. Canaliculae are little canals that are connecting the lakes. Who lives in the lakes? A mature osteocyte. And we mentioned that osteoclasts are the other type of cell that breaks down the bone. Spongy bone is going to have, it's not going to have a compact bone on it. It'll just be on the edges, on the epiphysis. But in between there, we're going to have spongy bone. And so our spongy bone are going to have struts. Those struts are called trabeculae. And if you remember, arches are very strong architecturally. An arch is a very strong structure. So you're going to see all of these arches all throughout the spongy bone is nothing but trabeculae in there. So it can withstand pressures from all different angles in there. Another benefit of this arched trabeculae in spongy bone is that it is very lightweight. If anybody has looked at a bird skeleton, I was just talking about chicken bones. If you looked inside of them, they got lots of spongy bone, very little compact bone, because birds are super duper light. They're light, there's nothing but spongy bone in there. So this spongy bone is going to reduce weight. It has this trabeculae, these arches in here. And again, this is going to be found in places where you're going to get pressure from all different places, where bones are not going to be heavily stressed, but they'll be stressed in many different directions. And you're going to have red bone marrow found in these places between those trabeculae. You're not going to have blood vessels flowing, you're not going to have this giant central canal and perforating canals in there, because we're not going to have these it's not going to be the same structure with the trabeculae all over the place. So no blood vessels in the matrix itself in spongy bone. It's going to have the nutrients come through the little canals that we mentioned to bring them to the osteons. And we can see our picture of the flat bone, and it's going to have the spongy bone. It's going to have compact bone on the edges. It's like a sandwich, and the compact bone is the bread, and then the good stuff inside the sandwich, whether it's chicken salad or meat or whatever it is that you've got in there. Maybe you got a veggie sandwich. Your veggie, your heartier sandwich, the good stuff, is going to be the spongy bone and here on the flat bone, and called diplo. We need to know that we talked about bones have foramen, these holes where the blood flow comes through. So we are going to have a nutrient foramen that's going to have the arteries and the veins bringing the blood flow to it. And we've got one on our long bones. We have multiple ones. So we got one in the middle in the diaphysis, but there's also going to be some here up in the epiphysis and the metaphysis. So you're going to have blood flow going all through here. So nutrient foramens are the holes in the bone where the arteries and veins can bring the blood flow to them. So that finishes this video on the third section of chapter 6.